Okay, so welcome to today's Learning for Governance Initiative webinar. And I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Kevin Chang, who is Executive Director of Kuaʻāina Ulu ʻAuamo, or KUA, a nonprofit organization and IUCN Indigenous Peoples Organization member that has a mission to empower rural and Native Hawaiian community-based natural resource management initiatives with a vision of abundant resources. And I'd also like to introduce Ahmed Hamid, who is a PhD student with the Community Engaged Collab at Dalhousie University, who is doing his PhD work with KUA and will be leading the questions today. So over to you.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you for everyone for joining, so many people here. Yeah, and I have some questions and prompts for Kevin that I will ask to get the conversation going, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions from the audience as well. So I guess I'll just dive right into it and ask Kevin the first question, which is around how KUA was conceived, kind of the origin story of KUA, what were the initial goals, and what were the early years of KUA like?
So I think the work of KUA has existed for over 2 decades now. However, our work really was conceived about 22 years ago when a small group of rural Native Hawaiian fishing communities began to gather to share their concerns and their vision for managing their nearshore fisheries. That eventually became what they called the Hawaii Community Stewardship Network. So about a dozen communities that was kind of facilitated by a woman named Debbie Bowen-Smith, who was working for an international NGO at that time. So actually that effort was kind of bolstered by an international NGO that came to Hawaii and then kind of, I don't know if they went bankrupt or they had to leave Hawaii basically. But that was a lesson for our communities over time, working with large NGOs, including large NGOs based in Hawaii, and that there's a certain level of trust and partnership they wanted to build, but was difficult to build. And so they felt they needed to develop their own organization or mechanism to help do that. And that eventually became KUA. That network had an advisory council. That advisory council met at a point where the lady Debbie Bowen-Smith was having to leave Hawaii, and she wanted to know what they wanted. And they met and said they wanted to create a nonprofit. And then that's how myself and another colleague were hired to start it up. So that answers you.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I was going to also ask about the ʻAuamo network and how important that was in the early years of KUA, and maybe explaining that to the audience, what that is.
Yeah, so the ʻAuamo network essentially is basically the Hawaii Community Stewardship Network in its latest form. So the way I think of it is there's a Hawaii Community Stewardship Network. They needed a mechanism to keep them together. Then they created KUA, and then they changed their name to ʻAuamo, which means to move forward together. That network has since grown from about 10 to a dozen communities to over 40 today, and not just focusing on fisheries, but what we call malama aina in general, which is community-based stewardship management from shoreline to mountain ridges.
Good. And could you explain yourself how you got connected with KUA too and became like the director? Just your journey.
Yeah. My background is I'm an attorney, but I don't really practice law anymore. I was kind of tired of it, and then I got involved in what they call conservation. Never even knew that word. Never knew there was a field called conservation. didn't know what an NGO was or a nonprofit was. But some of the stuff, the work they were doing appealed to me. And so I got involved in work about acquiring land for indigenous local communities and governments for culture and conservation and agricultural purposes. And so that kind of got me immersed in kind of ways to better relations between communities and place. Then I worked for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, helping the Office of Hawaiian Affairs develop a vision and strategy around land ownership and management. It was a period during that period, it was kind of a renaissance in terms of Hawaiians through the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, at the least, was really contemplating, okay, why are we waiting for lands? Why don't we go get them? And so I was kind of privileged to be a part of that. And I learned in that situation that it doesn't matter what government we're talking about, everyone is kind of hamstrung about how to deal with citizens, whether they're indigenous people or just people in the area who want to contribute to caring for a place. And the common pattern was to work with them to acquire the land and then to put up fences and not really allow them to interface with the place, because it takes more. It takes more for a government to actually work with its citizens in that way. So I saw this opportunity for building KUA as a way to bridge that and address that gap between government and people. You know, I think of it as a governance gap that allows citizens to really like assert their aloha for their environment and their culture and their relationship with it all.
I'm wondering if you could explain where KUA is situated right now in Hawaii in terms of, there's the state agencies, there's the government, there's federal agencies, so many communities working there and community organizations, and then nonprofits, like you mentioned, internationally as well. Where do you see KUA fitting into that landscape in Hawaii today?
Yeah. Well, actually, let me clarify too. So the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is a semi-sovereign state agency created by the state of Hawaii to be sort of the trust receptacle for the development of a future Hawaiian nation. So Native Hawaiians do not have the same kind of recognition that many Native Americans do with the United States. And so this entity, Office of Hawaiian Affairs, is just a state entity. But when I worked there, one of their missions is to promote and increase the recognition of the Native Hawaiian nation nationally and internationally. And while I was there, I was involved in developing and supporting what was called the World Conservation Congress and promoting the idea that the IUCN should bring that to Hawaii. Hawaii became the first, I guess, sub-state to host such a venue. And I felt like in our work, the connection to the international efforts and movements of indigenous people is not just a learning opportunity, it's a governance opportunity, it's an opportunity to gain perspective on common causes, but also to understand when and where we're doing better or where we can get better, because we can easily get in our silos, especially on islands. And the Hawaiian nation at one time was internationally recognized and very involved in the world. And so I don't see why Hawaii and Hawaiian communities cannot be involved in the world that way. We have a lot to learn, a lot to teach and share.
That's very insightful. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, and just asking about where KUA is in terms of other nonprofit organizations in Hawaii, but also facilitating the work with communities on the ground while also working with government.
Well, KUA physically is in Kahalu on the island of Oahu. I'm in the office right now. KUA has been in existence now for 12 years, like I said, our work has been going on for 20, so it depends on how you think about it. We're 20 years old or we're 12 years old. So ʻAuamo is over 20 years old. We have grown in the last decade or so from a team of 1.5 to about 10. We started with ʻAuamo network, and over time have expanded to 3 networks. ʻAuamo, which is like a general Malama Aina, caring for the land and the oceans kind of mission for communities, and then the Hui Malama Lokoʻia network, which is a network of traditional aquaculture restoration efforts across the state. Approximately 40 or so groups and 60 restoration sites. And then our youngest network is called the Limu Hui, which is a little different because they're primarily made up of individuals, not organizations, who are interested in the cultivation, care, and cultural use of native seaweed. Like I was kind of saying earlier, you asked me where we stand, or what's our, I guess, our positionality maybe. Like I said, I think we were partly created to help people, partners play better in the sandbox together. Larger NGOs would tend to be kind of patronizing, or often would kind of hoard the resources to some degree. Often bring staff members here who have no understanding or relationship to our culture. And this always created problems and conflicts. And often they came in with their own agendas, not trying to figure out what the community's agendas are itself. And to some degree, I think KUA was created to help moderate some of that. So we do a lot of, so outside of our network gatherings, which are, excuse me, something popped up asking me if I'm speaking French. I'm not speaking French, so hopefully you can understand me. Where was I going? So I think like some of the core things we do are we have these large gatherings of each network each year in a different place. I think of it as a social process. At the end, we often end up with kind of a magical experience and feeling from our members, because they're rejuvenated to do their work. They see that others are doing their work, that they're not alone in the work they do. And often they start to see common issues that they can work together on. And I see that as like a social process, which allows this to develop this kind of spirit of governance over time through the networks. But we also exist to help advocate certain issues, larger issues that support the change in the environment that communities need to self-determine, co-govern, co-manage their relationships with the state. These include like advocating for new positions within the state that are hopefully occupied by native or local hires, expansion of those jobs that have the most interface with communities, like enforcement officers. So, over the years, we've supported the development of a enforcement academy, which has uniquely improved, I think, community government relationships and ability of the state to enforce natural resource laws. We've supported issues like the environmental court, which before the environmental court was created, there was probably no judge who could identify one fish from another in any kind of case involving like overfishing. And the tendency was for the judges to prioritize social crimes versus resource crimes. And so the nature has always given a short shrift in all these different arenas. And so we're kind of created to help fill those gaps, or argue that those gaps should be filled. So, you know, like this shirt here I'm wearing, so it's a coalition, we're part of it. For the last 10 years, um, has been pushing for what we call a green fee, that the state would collect from tourists coming to Hawaii, of which, if we get what we want, will be a large percentage would be available to go to community efforts across the state. And the other part would go to support the state. And hopefully a blend of that will support community and state partnership when they do want to partner.
Mhm.
So I do think like positionality, going back to positionality, we're involved in the Hawaii Conservation Alliance, which is like a version of IUCN for Hawaii, which is also the reason why we're involved in IUCN, because there's ability to influence the larger national, local, and global conservation movement by having a voice in these places. KUA was the chair of HCA recently. We were able to arrange for the visit of Secretary Deborah Holland to speak to our communities. I've seen over the last 10 years, I feel partly due to our work, but many people's work in the kind of same vision alignment. We've seen that conference, the Hawaii Conservation Conference, become more diverse, reflect a younger generation, but also a generation that's about aloha aina. Whereas if you went to it like 20, 30 years ago, it's a bunch of white hair, old guys not from Hawaii talking about kind of abstract or kind of unuseful science as far as like practical management is concerned. We do the same at the IUCN as well.
Mhm. I was gonna, while you were talking about advocacy, I know KUA does a lot of work with lawmakers or pushing certain legislation that is helpful to communities. I wanted to ask you, KUA doesn't take specific positions on legislature or push for certain political action with communities, and I was just wondering what's the thinking behind that? What's the wisdom there?
Well, we take positions on bigger things, yeah. Like I was saying, we take positions on like policies that are going to have a trickle-down effect on our communities, like more funding, like more enforcement, more real permanent jobs that are in roles to collaborate with communities. But we also, yeah, we don't take a position on everything. Our focus is community and place-based. So, for example, there are bigger issues that come across the table that our communities might want to support, that we won't maybe directly take a position in. For example, some of you may be familiar with the issues surrounding Mauna Kea here in Hawaii. Some of our team members are directly involved in some of the Mauna Kea work. However, nobody lives at Mauna Kea. There is no community in Mauna Kea. Mauna Kea is an issue for the whole state. And so we didn't take a strong public position, but we spent time helping and supporting our community members up there. We took them up there, but we were not really heavily involved in that effort. Another issue is aquarium fishing in Hawaii is a tension-filled issue. A number of our communities on Hawaii Island have long opposed aquarium fishing in their waters. And so we have to walk a fine line in that when they are supporting rules to regulate their aquarium fishery and they want our help, then we try to help them and can advocate that. When they're, however, trying to pass a law to make a whole state ban on aquarium fisheries, then it's not really our role to be part of that, because the idea is that self-determination should be coming from the people of the places And then there are decisions that are kind of bigger than us, that we don't necessarily need to get involved in, if that makes sense. So you muddy the waters too much, then everybody thinks you're about everything and doing everything, and then
Mhm.
you implode,
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. While you were talking about self-determination, and when I think about community-based management, I kind of think about CBSFAs. And I was wondering if you could tell the audience more about CBSFAs and how they are kind of a model in Hawaii for community-based management.
Yeah, so the state of Hawaii has a law called the Community-Based Subsistence Fishing Area Law, created in the 90s, based on the efforts of Uncle Mac Poi Poi and the Hui Malama Momi, on the island of Molokai. Uncle Mac is one of our founders, actually, of our work and the network, the ʻAuamo network. So once that law was passed, a number of communities saw an opportunity in this, because this is the only law in our state that says in the law that the rules and regulations, the policies, should be determined by the traditional and cultural practices of the place. There's no other law like that. I mean, hopefully there'll be more like that someday in the forest and things like that. But so it's a really unique leverage point for changing the way environmental governance and management works. And it's a point where communities, and we've been helping communities advocate and push for more co-management and co-governance with the state. It's taken, so it was 1994, taken over almost 30 years to get to this point where we today have 3 community-based subsistence fishing areas. Mo'omome still not having been designated, but 3, one in Hana or North Kauai, another in Miloli'i, South Kona on Hawaii Island, and in Kipahulu, in East Maui, in next to Hana, if you guys are familiar with Hana is. And yeah, that's a unique. I view that those who study international stuff around indigenous conservation, I think of CBSFAs as the equivalent to ICCAs, OECMs. I forget the terms that they use in Canada, but basically indigenous conserved areas. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Canada has IPCAs, Indigenous Protected
IPCA,
Areas. Yeah.
that's the word. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And with relation to CBSFAs, but generally community-based management, I was hoping you could talk a bit more about the tensions between community, state, and then also commercial fishers or commercial interests in Hawaii.
Yeah. I mean, the hardest part and my most favorite part of this work is that these processes, which are ever evolving, require a community to confront itself, and I think that that's a key kind of tension point to increase self-determination. That's what democracy is about: confronting ourselves, trying to make decisions together. And it's hard. It's not easy. Since the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, our resource management division has primarily been used to allow for extraction and use of our resources, and not really their protection, despite the platitudes. And so our whole community has gotten used to that kind of what do you call it, status quo. And so when anyone starts to want to like manage a place, and I want to say reasonably, because there are people who are unreasonable on both sides of this, the arguments around management, people get concerned about their way of life and whatnot. And so often it's our own communities and their own family members who end up having to confront each other through these processes. Like in Hawaiian, people talk about is the term hihia. Hihia is like a bunch of tightly wound kind of ropes, and they kind of represent this kind of collective tension. And the only way we can, the only way we can unwind that hihia is through going through it together. And so that's why I say it's like the blessing and the curse. But then there's also fishing interests, because I think you're wanting me to talk about that too. There's also fishing interests that to some degree they have no they kind of don't really have a place to be opposing nearshore fishery issues and subsistence fishing issues. Often there are large commercial or charter boats and like tuna fishery kind of boats who, because of their politics or whatnot, view any encroachment on rules anywhere on fishing as an encroachment on their rights 200 miles out to sea. And so there's always sort of a mixed bag of people who get involved in some of these issues and for what reasons and whatnot.
That makes sense. I was also going to ask you about, I see KUA as a player, obviously, in Hawaii, helping communities or facilitating. How do you see KUA's vision internationally when you go to different places and you're a member of different organizations? What's the vision there? Is it to, expose more people to what's happening in Hawaii or take lessons from there? And generally, how do you, kind of building that global solidarity as well, if you had thoughts about that?
I see the international stuff from many angles. So it was partly why I was hired, because of my involvement in trying to build already international bridges through the Office of Foreign Affairs. but I see what we're able to do, say at the IUCN and ICCA and the IIFB, ability to have the same conversations and help build the same kind of progress we've had in building here in Hawaii through our networks, but also the partnerships at places like the Hawaii Conservation Alliance. I've seen, for example, I was in Thailand last week with 40 other indigenous people and indigenous organization representatives discussing what's called the United Nations Environmental Program GEO7 report. It's a report that comes out every 4 or 5 years on the state of the environment. It goes to all heads of state in the world, essentially. And this year, so I see this as an indicator, a hope of change. This year is the first year they're going to be considering and talking about indigenous people and local communities' roles in environmental care. 5 years ago, we were involved through the ICCA and some partners at places like the First Peoples Program, creating what's called so the UN report is called the Global Environmental Outlook. So 5 years ago, we worked on what's called the Local Biodiversity Outlook, which was an alternative to this report because this global report was not inclusive of the many efforts of indigenous and local communities throughout the world. And so I feel like over the time, we're seeing things like this change, that we're first saying these things at a grassroots level, but we keep saying them, and it's starting to be said at a global governance level. So things like that, ability through like an IUCN to work together with other IPOs. We were able to start a program within the IUCN that currently I think we raised 5 million, but we're looking to grow a pool of funding to support Indigenous people, local community efforts around the world. Our interest in that is to push for funding that helps our communities here in Hawaii build exchanges and share with other communities around the world. Did that answer your question?
Yes, yeah. And I do have a follow-up with that because
Yeah.
when you were talking about exchanges, I was thinking about how there's more concerns about younger people too, maybe getting disconnected with the work and with the land. Do you have programs or, work that you do to engage more younger people in Hawaii and outside?
Yeah, we have a youth, yeah, ʻAuamo has a youth council. That's always like interesting to me as someone who's becoming an old person. What do we do about the transition and changes in generations? And I think you were talking the other day about what the difference between intergenerational and multi-generational. The idea of intergenerational often is a top-down. Everybody who has the OG status can kind of tell everybody what to do, and everyone honors and follows them. Or there's the multi-generational status, which I think is really what is happening as there is a shift going on in the conservation community. The people, like I said, at the conferences are younger. They're talking more about both conventional scientific processes, but also traditional, long-lasting perspectives of knowledge that communities have built over centuries, not thousands of years. And they're trying to bring the two together. But when they do that, they're also seeing their own way forward, which may not always comport with their elders. But I also see elders being more and more open to that, because the thing that's always involved is change is always there in some way, and we got to figure out how to adapt and continue.
That sounds really inspiring. And related to that, change. There's a lot of change that's happened politically and administration change in the US. What are you thinking with that? Would that affect the way things are done in Hawaii, or are you concerned about certain things with KUA?
Right now, so I'd say in the first 5-6 years of our existence, partly my own kind of pig-headedness is that we don't need to work with the federal government. Federal grants and those kind of support are burdensome, and they continue to be burdensome on small communities. If anything, we advocate at that level to make it easier. And then when the latest administration, the Biden administration, actively pushed policies to support Indigenous knowledge, hired a Secretary of the Interior who was Native American and a Director of Parks who's Native American, who was a friend of mine. Then I saw a different shift and opportunity, and that's when we became more involved in national efforts. I'm afraid now that that may be diminishing, and that's fine because it's less work for me, actually. The opportunity, I mean, I don't know if you've seen, right? I guess the Trump administration, under their immigration issues, has filed some claim with the U.S. Supreme Court, claiming that Native Americans should not have birthright citizenship because their allegiance is to their tribal nations. That's very interesting. So I don't know how, we're only like a couple of days in, but I think it's the political environment's going to change. People who are anti-Hawaiian or anti kind of anything around culture or race, gender and whatnot, is going to be more open to attack. And the practice of canceling people is going to be going in a different direction. And that's going to affect the culture of everything we do. You know, they're trying to eliminate, or I guess they're going to eliminate all of the environmental justice initiatives that the past administration did. Those last 4 years, I was able to get to know and work directly with the head of the White House Council on Environment. Pretty sure Trump is going to shut that office down. So there's a lot of, not going to be good.
Yeah, a lot of worrying stuff. And just related to that, I guess I wanted to ask, what are KUA's kind of priorities going into this year, 2025? What are the things that are on the agenda for KUA? And I guess a lot of it is, you know, continuing the work that's you've been building on, but just a brief picture of that.
Yeah, we continue our gatherings. Our gatherings are those places where the inspiration grows, but also the ideas come from. And then in between the larger gatherings, we have smaller efforts to work on specific issues. And that kind of activity will continue. This year, we also will likely take a group to the World Conservation Congress in October. And we're also planning an exchange, honestly, in June or July. Actually, this is an exchange I've been wanting to see for a while. So we would send a group of probably our CBSFA fishing community leaders to Tahiti to learn about the Rahui system in Tahiti and in the Cook Islands, and vice versa, hoping they can come here because there's a lot of similarities there, not just in ancestry, but in cultural value and practice.
That sounds good. And I know some members are also thinking about going to Australia for a conference to the ICCB. There's some work going on there as well, which is exciting. Yeah, I guess that's most of my questions. One last one that I would just end with is, you've been with KUA for 12 years or more, 20 almost. How have you changed kind of community-based management? And are there like avenues for like a lot of hope, or you know, sometimes do you get hopeless about conservation in general in Hawaii?
No, I don't get hopeless. I think what if anything, I have to have evolved in my perspective that change comes by a slower process. Sometimes it's incremental, and you have to be able to kind of lift your head out of it now and then and understand that you have made change, because it's so easy to forget it when your head is down. That's another thing the international perspective kind of provides. People were amazed when they came to Hawaii for the World Conservation Congress of what we had going on here. And the meanwhile, we thought we were deficient. And so I think that's how I've evolved. A lot of it has been around that. Like, we are making a difference. You know, there are 3 community-based subsistence fishing areas. Fish ponds now have streamlined permitting to do restoration. Limu is being more recognized by the state and remembered by our community as a whole, not just our networks. People know more about what our network members are doing. It's in the news now. The terminology that our communities use is very common now among the populace. And I think it's kind of like the more you say it, at some point, saying has to mean doing. And that's how I see some things working.
Yeah, amazing work. And I would just say to the audience too, that a lot of stuff on all of the work that KUA does is on the website as well. And there's sections there where you can read more about some of the things that Kevin's talking about. And obviously you can get in touch with Kevin too. Yeah, I'll guess open it up to questions from the audience.
Thanks so much, Kevin, for sharing KUA's amazing work, and Ahmed for facilitating the discussion. I'm just going to stop the recording so that everybody feels comfortable asking their questions, because of course we weren't able to get consent ahead of this for the recording. So I'll just stop